Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 44 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Edmonton Oilers, in which the Sharks have lost 7-1. An absolutely disastrous loss here for the San Jose Sharks. The last time they had such a disastrous loss was all the way back against the Calgary Flames, the other Alberta team in the NHL. And when I say all the way back, I mean it only happened less than a month ago, and that is including the Christmas break and other multi-day breaks for the San Jose Sharks. So in fact, the game against the Flames was only a few games ago, so it's definitely not a very good look for the Sharks defensively to once again here let in yet another 7 goals and just get absolutely demolished. Now, what was interesting about this game is that in the first period, it didn't start off that horrifically for the Sharks. While they didn't necessarily play well, like at all, they didn't actually give the Oilers either all that much to play with. And so even though Edmonton did of course score still 2 goals in that first period, the first was on a power play, the second one was an extremely lucky bounce. And so going into the second period, there was definitely technically a chance for the Sharks to maybe refocus and try and get back into this game, but the second period the wheels just completely came off. Just an absolutely disastrous performance from the San Jose Sharks. It was just a situation where I remember it was a few games ago where David Quinn gave the quote of, "Oh, the Sharks, they're cheating too much for offense. They need to get back to playing defense." And that's all well and good, but when you're in a situation against the Oilers, they've got McDavid and Draisaitl. Draisaitl's one of the best players in the game, and McDavid is the best player in the game. Playing shifts in the defensive zone against that line, those two players, is not necessarily a strong recipe for success. The best way to beat McDavid and Draisaitl is by forcing them to play in their own zone, not trying to keep them to the perimeter. If the Sharks actually had the ability and the secret to actually shutting down McDavid and Draisaitl in the offensive zone, Mike Grier could probably sell that off for 3 first-round picks with only 18% of his contract retained, but that is not the case here. The Sharks do not have that secret sauce. They needed to play in the offensive zone, and they literally did none of that, or very, very little of that in this game. And so in this second period, it really continued to get away from them. Another power play goal from McDavid, a Nugent-Hopkins shorthanded goal, then a Draisaitl goal, and suddenly it's 5-0. The Sharks are pretty much completely out of the game. The third period, not as disastrous of the second period, but obviously the Oilers can kind of just let their foot off the gas considering they have a game tomorrow, and so they even still managed to pile on a couple of more goals to put it to 7-0. The Sharks prevented complete embarrassment by being able to get a goal from Lindblom to prevent a shutout here, but it still ends up being probably one of the worst, if not the worst, losses for the San Jose Sharks this season, with this 7-1 demolition here against Edmonton. On to the players to talk about. Really, I don't have much to say about them. The vast majority of them had quite bad games. Even the ones that didn't play all that horrifically are not worthy of praise here on a night in which they all lost 7-1. So there are just a few things that I want to talk about when it comes to the lineup. And the first one has to do with the Sharks' first line, where Meier and Hertl obviously are headlining it, and they are actually joined by Michael Eyssimont here tonight. And I've been the number one Michael Eyssimont fan over these past couple of games. I talked about how he has rejuvenated the Sharks' third line, has actually looked quite active in the offensive zone. I have heaped on a lot of praise, but I am not a crazy person to think that all of this praise is worthy of him moving up to the first line with Meier and Hertl, and it just goes to show how desperate David Quinn is to find something to do in this top 6, that he will take a player who wasn't even on the Sharks roster more than a couple of weeks ago and put them on the first line after a couple of decent games where, mind you, he didn't even get a singular point registered, so it's not as though he's absolutely lighting it up on that third line, and yet he found himself on this first line. Meanwhile, I might add that there are multiple high-level prospects for the San Jose Sharks in the San Jose Barracuda who are currently sitting there because, well, they need to earn their keep, and there's not enough room here on this Sharks roster. Meanwhile, some rando off of waivers from the Winnipeg Jets just a few days ago has managed to find himself on the first line because he gave David Quinn the slightest time of day in his first couple of performances, and suddenly, like, he is now the belle of the ball. So it just seems like a very awkward situation, and even though I am saying this, I don't think Eyssimont was terrible on this first line. It just doesn't really make much sense to me, the situation here. It just continues to frustrate me when it comes to how the Sharks are dealing with their farm team in the Barracuda, and Eyssimont here on the first line. A couple of other players to mention. I do want to talk about Cicek, who comes in here into the Sharks' top 6 defense with Harrington injured. Not a surprise there. He was, on the road trip. He's clearly been the Sharks', technically 8th defenseman, since it's both Šimek and Harrington injured now, and this was an absolutely disastrous game for Cicek. He was a big reason why the Sharks fell into a hole early. He took the penalty that led to the McDavid goal, then he took the second penalty that led to the second McDavid goal, and defensively, he was an absolute disaster. A really, really bad game for Nick Cicek. Now, if his name was not Nick Cicek, he would probably be on the first train out of here. He wouldn't even get the opportunity to play another game with the San Jose Sharks, especially if I think of like a Ryan Merkley or like a Santeri Hatakka. If they were one of these players, they probably would never see the time of day that get their contract bought out. They'd be completely gone. But Cicek will probably end up with a slap on the wrist and likely even start in the Sharks' next game in a couple of days, even after this awful performance here tonight. The other player who I do want to mention was Matt Benning. Of course, was 1 point, sadly, at the very least, the premier defensive defenseman for the San Jose Sharks earlier on this season, was playing decently well, but he was for sure exposed here tonight. We saw multiple times him find himself on the ice against players like McDavid, like Draisaitl, and he was just getting embarrassed out there. Multiple giveaways. One of them led to the Draisaitl goal that made it 5-0. There was another giveaway to Draisaitl early on in the first period that did not result into a goal, but it was still directly off of the stick of Matt Benning, and it wasn't necessarily that Benning was, fanning on a pass and it was getting picked off or it was deflecting off or something. No, Matt Benning has the puck. He just completely gets pressured by these two players and is overwhelmed essentially and ends up giving it up. So just generally, like I said earlier, a very rough game for the lineup all around. And of course, the goaltender cannot escape the criticism here. Yes, many of these goals he didn't necessarily have much of a chance on. I look at the second McDavid goal, of course the Costin goal as well, the Nugent-Hopkins goal. He certainly did all he could on some of them, but you take a look at like the McDavid one, the first McDavid one, this one's kind of from far out, and McDavid is a very good shooter, but he's not necessarily the best shooter in the NHL. He's just the best player in the NHL, and so this is technically a stoppable shot. It's not as though it even went like top corner, perfectly placed, unbelievable, amazing style. And then there were definitely a couple of saves that he could have made. It would not have mattered in the end. The Sharks would have lost 5-1 at that point, or 4-1. It still just would have been a loss. Just maybe not as embarrassing, but it just goes to show that yes, the defense has been not good for the San Jose Sharks, but the goaltending has not done any favors and has in fact been even worse than the Sharks defense at times. And so that will do it for this review, I guess. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, where they will take on the New Jersey Devils in an afternoon game. The first time the Sharks played the Devils this season, they lost, and so they will get their second and final matchup here against New Jersey. Of course, the Devils find themselves near the top of the standings, maybe not as proficient at goal scoring, you could technically say, as the Edmonton Oilers, because they don't have McDavid and Draisaitl on their team, so they might not get as lit up, but if they come up with a performance here tonight, it's going to be equally as embarrassing and maybe even more so. Class dismissed.